Ronan Blackthorn had never doubted his own strength. He was the alpha king of the Northern Wolf Territories, a man who had clawed his way to power through war, loss, and iron will. He had buried brothers, defeated rivals, and rebuilt his pack from ruins twice. So when the moon bond flared to life on the night of his coronation feast, marking a quiet, unremarkable young woman as his fated mate, he felt only irritation. Her name was Alira Voss. She was the daughter of the pack's late healer, a girl with soft eyes and a soft voice, who had spent her whole life at the edges of gatherings instead of the center of them. She had no title, no army behind her family name, no political weight to offer the pack. When the bond snapped taut between them, pulling her forward through the crowd toward the throne, Ronan looked at her the way a man might look at an unwanted gift. "This cannot be right," he said, loud enough for the hall to hear. Alira said nothing. She simply lowered her eyes and stepped back into the crowd, her cheeks burning with a shame that did not belong to her. From that night on, Ronan made his position clear, without ever needing to repeat it. He did not summon her to his chambers. He did not claim her before the pack. He did not so much as speak her name unless forced to. Alira became a ghost in her own home, tolerated but invisible, while Ronan turned his attention to strategic alliances, meeting with daughters of powerful packs who could offer him soldiers, land, or old debts repaid. Alira did not fight for his attention. She had never been taught to fight for anything that wasn't already broken and bleeding in front of her. Instead, she did what she had always done. She healed. She took over her mother's old duties, tending to the sick, the injured, the forgotten corners of pack life that no one else wanted to touch. She learned every herb in the western forest, every old remedy passed down through generations of healers before her, and she gave her nights to people who barely knew her name. The pack noticed, even if their king did not. Elders spoke quietly among themselves about the shame of an alpha who could not honor his own mate. Young wolves whispered that the healer's daughter deserved better than a king too proud to look at her, but no one dared say such things where Ronan could hear them, and Alira never asked anyone to defend her. She simply kept working, kept healing, and kept her sorrow folded small enough to carry, without anyone noticing the weight of it. 2 years passed this way. Then the sickness came. It began with a single hunting party returning from the eastern ridge, 3 wolves stumbling home with fevers that would not break. Within a week, the fever had spread through the training grounds, then the nursery, then the elders' quarters. Wolves who had survived battles and famine dropped where they stood, their bodies racked with a shaking cold that no fire could warm. The pack's senior healers tried every remedy in their arsenal. Nothing worked. The sickness did not behave like anything they had studied. It moved through the blood itself, turning strength into weakness, turning wolves who could once outrun storms into shadows who could barely lift their heads. Ronan watched his pack crumble with a helplessness he had never known. He had faced enemies with claws and swords his entire life, enemies he could meet and defeat with strength alone. This enemy had no face. It could not be fought, only endured, and his people were dying faster than his healers could even name what was killing them. Word spread beyond the pack's borders, as it always does when weakness shows itself. Rival packs that had once feared Ronan's strength began testing the edges of his territory, sending scouts closer than they ever dared before. Ronan doubled his guard, but he knew, with the cold clarity of a king who had seen empires fall, that a pack too sick to fight was a pack already halfway to conquered. It was Alira who first noticed the pattern no one else had seen. She had been at her mother's bedside years ago when a similar fever had swept through a neighboring pack, one her mother had traveled to help before Alira was even born. Her mother used to tell her the story on quiet evenings, half memory and half legend, about a sickness that attacked the blood of wolves and could only be cured by something her mother called moonblood magic, an old, nearly forgotten healing power carried by a bloodline so rare most believed it extinct. Alira had always thought it was simply a bedtime story, but as she knelt beside a young wolf named Talia, the girl's pulse fluttering weak and rapid beneath her fingers, the old story surfaced in her mind with startling clarity. The fever pattern matched. The blackened veins beneath the skin matched. Even the order in which the body weakened, starting at the paws and moving inward toward the heart, matched exactly what her mother had once described. She spent that night in her mother's old cottage, tearing through boxes of journals she had never had the courage to read since her mother's death. Deep in the last box, wrapped in cloth soft with age, she found her mother's private notes on the Moonblood healers, an ancient line of women said to carry ancestral magic in their veins, magic that could purify corrupted wolf blood at the cost of the healer's own strength. The notes ended with a single line that made Alira's hands go cold. The last known descendant of the Moonblood line is myself, and now, my daughter. Alira sat alone in the dark for a long time after reading those words. She had spent her whole life believing she had nothing to offer, no power, no name worth speaking. Now she held proof that she carried something ancient and rare in her blood, something that might be the only thing standing between her pack and total collapse. The fear of what the ritual might cost her sat heavy in her chest. Her mother's notes were clear that the process could drain a healer past the point of return. But she thought of Talia's fluttering pulse, of the children in the nursery too weak to cry, of an entire pack rotting from the inside while their king paced helplessly through empty halls. She did not tell anyone what she planned to do. She did not think anyone would believe her, and she did not want to be stopped. That night, Alira gathered the herbs her mother's notes described, drew the old symbols on the floor of the healing house with trembling hands, and began the ritual meant only for a true Moonblood healer. She did not know, as she began, whether her blood carried enough of the old magic to work at all. She only knew she had to try. The first hour brought nothing but exhaustion, her limbs trembling as she poured her energy into the symbols, into Talia's still body laid before her. Then, slowly, silver light began to rise from the markings on the floor, wrapping around Talia like mist given form. Alira felt something ancient wake inside her chest, a pulse that was not entirely her own, old and vast and hungry for the strength she offered it. She did not stop. She let it take what it needed, watching as the blackened veins beneath Talia's skin slowly faded back to a healthy pink. Word of Talia's sudden recovery spread through the pack by morning, and desperate families began bringing their sick to Alira's door, one after another, through the day and into the night. She did not turn a single one away. Each ritual left her weaker, paler, her hands shaking harder each time she lit the old symbols, but she kept going, driven by something deeper than fear. She had spent 2 years believing she was worth nothing to this pack. Now, for the first time, she understood what her mother's stories had truly meant. Ronan found out what she had been doing on the 4th night, when a guard burst into his study with news that half the sick pack members had recovered overnight, all treated by the same healer, the girl he had ignored since the night of his coronation. He went to the healing house expecting to find some clever trick, some remedy his own healers had simply overlooked. Instead, he found Alira on her knees before a circle of fading silver light, her skin ashen, blood trailing from her nose, her whole body trembling as she reached for one more handful of herbs to begin again. "Stop," Ronan said, his voice cracking through the room before he even understood why. Alira looked up at him, her eyes glassy with exhaustion. "There are still 6 more waiting," she whispered. "I can't stop yet." "You will die if you continue," he said, crossing the room in 3 strides, kneeling beside her, gripping her shoulders, as if he could hold the strength back inside her body by force alone. "They will die if I don't," she answered simply, and there was no anger in her voice, no accusation for the years he had ignored her. Only quiet certainty, the same quiet certainty that had carried her through every lonely night since the bond first marked them. Something in Ronan broke open at those words. He thought of every meeting he had taken with other Pack's daughters, while this woman quietly saved lives in the shadows he never bothered to look into. He thought of every night he had turned away from her without a second glance, every small cruelty of his indifference that she had absorbed without complaint. He had called himself a king who protected his people, yet he had spent 2 years failing to see the one person who had never stopped protecting them in his place. "Then I will carry the weight with you," he said, and before she could argue, he reached for the last of the herbs himself, adding his own strength to the circle, as an alpha's power flooded through the ritual alongside hers. The silver light surged brighter than it ever had before, wrapping around them both. Alira gasped as she felt Ronan's strength pour into the bond between them, steadying the wild pull of the ancient magic threatening to unravel her from the inside. Together, they moved through the remaining sick, the ritual growing stronger, with each casting instead of weaker, until the last trembling wolf rose from their sickbed, with color returned to their cheeks. When it was finished, Elira collapsed, her body finally giving out from days of relentless strain. Ronan caught her before she hit the ground, carrying her to his own chambers for the first time since the bond had marked them, refusing to leave her side as healers worked to stabilize what remained of her strength. She did not wake for 2 full days. Ronan sat beside her through every hour of it, his crown discarded, his duties handed to his second, unwilling to be anywhere else. When her eyes finally fluttered open, the first thing she saw was her mate, the Alpha King who had once refused to even speak her name, holding her hand as though he would never let go again. "You saved us," he said quietly. "You saved all of us, and I gave you nothing in return." "You're here now," she whispered. "I should have been here from the beginning," he said, and the shame in his voice was real, unguarded in a way his people had never heard from him before. 3 days later, Ronan stood before the entire gathered pack, Elira beside him, her strength slowly returning with rest and care. He did not simply announce the mate bond this time. He knelt before her, in front of every wolf who had once whispered about the king's neglect, and asked her forgiveness for every night he had let his pride outweigh what fate had placed directly in front of him. The pack that had nearly been destroyed by an unstoppable sickness became, instead, the pack that survived because of a woman everyone had once overlooked. Elira, the last of the Moonblood healers, was no longer a ghost at the edges of gatherings. She stood at the center of pack life now, not because Ronan finally claimed her, but because she had never needed his permission to matter. Ronan spent the rest of his reign proving, in small ways every single day, that he understood what he had almost thrown away. And Elira, who had spent so many years believing quiet strength was worth nothing at all, finally understood that the ancient blood in her veins had never been the only thing that made her extraordinary. It had simply been the thing that finally made everyone else see what had been true from the very beginning.